There we go. Go hop in. Oops.
Hello, everyone. I'm Justin Stapley, the state director of the Utah Reagan Caucus. Um, One of the issues that has really divided this nation for over 50 years, and in some ways is dividing it even more because we are now in a post-Roe generation, is abortion policy. Today, I have with me Representative Cheryl Acton with the Utah State Legislature. Um, she has been a crucial advocate for the pro-life cause here in the state. Um, Cheryl, go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll talk about some of the topics we're going to discuss today.
Okay, thank you, Justin. And I'll kind of introduce myself around this topic a little bit. I came into the legislature 7.5 years ago, and I had always been pro-life, my whole life, but I had kind of averted my eyes. Um, as a regular citizen, I couldn't do anything about it beyond, voice my opinion. So I had kind of not delved into it that much, but I knew, at my core, I'm pro-life and I always have been. And then in just before the second year of my second general session, Pro-Life Utah and another organization in the state approached me to see if I would be interested in running a pro-life bill. And I really had to think about it for just a minute because I knew that that could be inflammatory, and
Yeah.
I knew I was very pro-life, but I wanted to really think about that for a second, and I did, and I realized, yes, I do, because the more I looked into it, the more concerned I became about the situation at that time, which was in 2018 at that time, but I ran my bill in 2019. And so after I accepted that challenge, I guess, to run a bill, I just threw myself into it. I was eating, sleeping, my every waking moment was thinking about abortion and how we could improve the situation. And this was under the Roe, at the time of Roe, and what could we do? And so I finally pulled together everything and I have probably hundreds of pages of notes on the subject. And the things that stood out to me the most, that were the most compelling, I pulled them together and I worked with a drafting attorney. We drafted a law. My law, the bill that I passed, did not come from any other state or organization. It was really kind of from the bottom up. Now, we were modeling it after a law, I believe, in Arkansas. I never actually read that law, but I knew about the law, which was a 15-week abortion law. And we thought, well, if we can get a similar bill, it won't be exact, we don't want it to be exact, and have it heading toward the Supreme Court at the same time, because we knew that the Arkansas law would head to the Supreme Court, and they reject Arkansas, then they'll have our law to decide, is that one something we could take?
Mm-hmm.
Well, fortunately, the Supreme Court acted before we got there,
Mm-hmm.
because our law was actually enjoined almost immediately after it passed. And so we were debating it still here in Utah. I mean, it had become law, but it hadn't been the law of the land because the courts had stopped it. And so we couldn't really, I mean, we had to wait for that to be, to have a decision. And anyway, eventually the plan was that it would get to the Supreme Court potentially, and it had to be ready for that.
Yeah.
And very fortunately, other states were acting kind of not in unison because we didn't collaborate at all, but like
Mm-hmm.
also had the same thoughts and were working toward the same goal. And then ultimately, of course, we know the Dobbs decision came down. And when that happened, the opponents of that law, which was Planned Parenthood Utah, they dropped the lawsuit against HB 136, which was the bill that we passed in 2019. And so it became the law of the land so that they could fight the trigger bill, which is the one that we're still waiting on out of the
Mhm.
Utah Supreme Court. So
Right.
it's, there's so much, so many, now that there's court involvement and stuff like that, it gets even more confusing. But
Well, yeah.
fundamentally, it's all about women, and it's also about the unborn and families, and so it's a large issue, and it is divisive, unfortunately.
I think two things that came to my mind as you were talking is we have this bad tendency right now in America's political culture to think of the parties, to think of approaches to various policies and issues as being monolithic. And I like that you really pointed out that, you know, you worked with people in Utah. You took what some other states had did as examples, but the bill you crafted, it wasn't some big, dark, shadowy, conglomerate national exercise. It was what policy fits Utah's politics, Utah's culture, etc. And it really that approach is what allows America to have 50 laboratories for democracy that helps us discover what the best policies are, what the best approach is, and then the good stuff kind of bubbles up from there. And I've really liked to think about the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade more as a decision on federalism than necessarily a decision on abortion, because they didn't actually make a decision on abortion, right? They
Right.
overturned a decision on abortion, and I don't think that the country should necessarily view Dobbs as being either pro-life or pro-choice, because as we've seen right now, actually, the pro-choice efforts have been scoring a lot of victories across the state when it comes to passing state level policy. And I think what's going on there to a certain extent is for 50 years, the American people haven't had to really wrestle with the question, right? Really
Right.
confront themselves. Kind of like you mentioned at the beginning, like until you got into the legislature, you were pro-life, but like, well, what can I do about it?
Mm-hmm.
The Supreme Court has ruled this is the way it is.
Right.
And now we're wrestling with it. And so obviously the initial impulse is going to be for a lot of people, well, it's easier to say, I want things back the way they were than it is to wrestle with the realities. Where do we stand on it?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people who are uncomfortable with legislation that's as early on as what ours is in Utah. But a lot of people are like, yeah, let's ban abortion in the third trimester, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's what passing this different state level legislation and stuff like that allows us to figure out. You know, um,
Exactly. And that's really the great thing. And that's something I was fighting for in my bill beyond abortion was states' rights returned because of the 10th Amendment, which says that everything that's not covered in the Constitution is reserved to the states. And when the federal government, even through a federal court, interferes with that, that's not constitutional. Each state will have its own take on abortion, and some will probably always have very liberal abortion laws until maybe someday something may change that. But for now, anyway, each state should be able to state, where they stand on abortion, what kind of laws they want to have. And so you're right, it is a victory. I mean, Dobbs was really for states' sovereignty, um, more so than abortion, although it did end, Roe v. Wade and as far as no state could ban abortion or could
right.
even ban abortion before 24 weeks, 22 weeks.
Mhm.
Prior to that, that's considered viability for the fetus. After the fetus becomes viable outside of the womb, they would allow states to decide the issue. But prior to viability, we were all forced to accept it.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, and I, as you know, because we've talked about this before, I'm a huge Madisonian. I read up on the Constitution. The and all this founding generation and era stuff. And even at that period of time, when America was so much smaller, very much smaller than we are now, they were worried how do you have a republic with so many people? Because before then, the only places that this approach to government had worked even for a little bit of time have been in city states, small places where, generally speaking, you could gain consensus, the culture was the same. Um, but in
Right.
America, it's so different from state to state. How do we live with each other without having essentially a majority rule situation where you get 52% in support of something and then their views get shoved down everybody else's throats? And
Mm,
that's why this approach to federalism was just such an amazing discovery and development, because it allows us to have a general government in the federal government that
mm,
decides things that we all have a consensus on. But then when we don't have a consensus, it allows us to essentially have 50 different organic political organizations. And abortion really is one of those issues where sometimes it feels like we're divided right down the middle. Now, there's a lot of different polls out there that kind of make things seem one way or the other, depending on how the question is asked, depending what the specific aspect of the issue was talked about. But really, you look at the states and we're divided right on the half, and that's what is awesome about this current situation is, you know, we can have things one way in Utah, but that doesn't impact New York. It doesn't impact a lot of these other states, and but
mm.
people are having a hard time, as you've mentioned, adjusting to that, right?
Yeah, and I think
And
there will be some jostling, for a
yeah.
while as we all come back to terms with the fact, oh, we're responsible for our own decision. Well, where do we stand? So
Mhm.
yeah, there will be some settling again because we got so complacent, or a lot of people did with during Roe, that, oh, this is what we have to do and we don't have a choice. Um, and there are so many parallels too to the slavery issue. So,
Mhm. Yeah.
when you look at that, including personhood, the personhood of the fetus, the personhood of a slave. Um, so there are just so many parallels there. And again, the state issue, and ultimately with slavery, which was kind of a reverse situation. But anyway, of course, we needed that was tearing us apart as a country. It resulted in
Right.
civil war. I hope that that would never happen with abortion, although people do feel very, very strongly. But I think you're
Right.
right. I think the 50-50 thing is partly because of misinformation.
Mhm.
And like you said, when the questions are not specific, which trimester of abortion are we talking about? I mean, that makes a huge difference. In fact, only 13% of adults in the United States approve of abortion in the third trimester.
Mhm.
Only 28% approve of it in the second trimester, but you continuously hear news reports that 60% of Americans approve of abortion.
Mhm.
And that is in the first trimester that we're talking about. So that's a very different thing, especially the methods used and
Mhm.
the harm that it does both to the woman and to the fetus. Obviously, the fetus is always the same result, but in terms of pain perception. Or the fetus can feel pain after a certain point in the pregnancy, and that's not acknowledged sometimes on the pro-abortion side. I mean, almost never do they acknowledge that. So, I
Yeah.
mean, there's a lot of nuance to the issue, and yeah, one question, yes or no, up or down, thumbs up,
Mhm.
doesn't usually cut it. Although if I had to make a choice, I would say let, go with life. That's always
Yeah.
the beginning of everything. But I don't get to choose for everyone, and
Right.
I don't get to choose really for anyone. I get to try to persuade people in my own legislature, maybe if I had a bill, but we have to be, as a republic, we have to hear all sides and consider all
Mhm.
sides and really reason things out. And it is hard. you know?
It's I've always been impressed with the fact that if you look throughout American history, whenever we settle difficult questions, but everybody had an opportunity to feel heard and be part of the process, it's amazing what the American people on both sides of an issue are willing to live with, so long as they've been heard. And that's what I
True.
think is beneficial about the returning it to the people, returning to the states in the question. One of the things that is creating difficulties for the pro-life effort right now is that, like, here in Utah, we have a pretty established consensus amongst most Republicans and conservatives that we're going to carve out exceptions for rape, for incest, for life-threatening situations, for whether or not the fetus is actually viable, and we don't really have a huge debate about those carve-outs in Utah, but we have a very unique culture. That is essentially the stance of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as most of us are members of in the state. But elsewhere throughout the country, you see a lot of pro-life efforts are trying to go way over the top. They're trying to essentially, there's some states where they're like, oh, let's throw women in prison for trying, or we're gonna, and there's all these excesses, and a lot of people are painting the pro-life movement as that exclusively, and it's making it difficult for us to talk about the nuances, um, like
Hmm.
like you're mentioning. Um, how do we? And I think this is part of the reality right now is, since people didn't have to wrestle with the issue because it was settled through the courts for so long. Most of the people that engaged in the issue were those that cared a lot about the issue and tended to be a bit more on the established all the way one way or all the way the other field. Um, and those kind of forces are not trying to, like, get in there and go all the way one way or the other. How do you think we wrestle with that? How do we get people to actually wrestle with the nuances of the issue?
I've thought a lot about this, and especially since Dobbs, because yes, some people are trying to use Dobbs in a fear-mongering way to gain votes and so forth. But I think the first thing we have to do is facts. We need to work with facts. And the fact is, there's not a state in the country that bars abortion for to save a woman's life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's extremely rare, like as in some of our some very prominent physicians have said in 36 years of practice, they've never had to abort to save a woman's life, for example. It's extremely rare circumstance,
Mm-hmm.
but if it were to happen, of course, a life is important. The woman's life is important. Every bit is important. But the other fact, or fact, the other thing that I see put forward all the time that is incorrect is that if a woman has an ectopic pregnancy, she would not be able to abort. That is not true. Ectopic pregnancies are not part of the elective abortion debate at all. They are considered healthcare. They are considered healthcare. So many things are not healthcare that they espouse to be
Mm-hmm.
healthcare. But an ectopic pregnancy or the removal of a miscarried fetus, those things are outside of the scope of elective abortion. Those are absolutely necessary to save the woman's life. And nobody would argue with that.
Mm-hmm.
But they use that on the other side of the argument to say, oh, if you have an ectopic pregnancy, you may die. That is not true. So those two falsehoods are spread a lot, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
constantly having to, and there is not another state in the union where those things apply. That those are considered reasons to, not allow a woman an abortion. So Dobbs also did not ban abortion, as you said.
Right.
There's a lot of misunderstanding about that. Dobbs did not ban abortion. It simply returned the issue to the states, and each state will have to decide. And immediately after Dobbs, some states went, or even sometimes before Dobbs, some states changed their laws so that, abortion right up to term is perfectly fine in those states. Um, that's where they landed with it. Utah, of course, and most other states do not accept that. But anyway, that fear mongering, I think, is the first thing that we need to address and make sure everyone's working with facts because
Right.
And once we're talking about other nuances, the other exceptions that Utah has, for example, and I believe, and I've never been able to verify this, but I believe Utah has the most exceptions. We have
Mm,
six, and all of them are meant to be reasonable. I would still counsel women in this situation, in any of these situations, possibly, depending on their specific circumstances, but to consider giving birth. And I would still recommend against abortion because it does harm women in other ways. And of course, it harms the fetus. But um, anyway, I would say that we need to consider, I would rather have a lot of exceptions, which we kind of do, than throw away a perfectly wonderful and healthy human being. So
mhm,
I'd rather work with those exceptions. So the rape exception, that's in our law. We have rape, incest, life of the mother, permanent impairment of the mother. So if
mhm,
some of her bodily functions would not be possible if she gives birth, she may make that decision to abort. And then also, yes, a fatal fetal problem that we know will result in death at birth. If she chooses then to abort that infant or the fetus rather than delivering to term, that would be her decision in Utah. And then finally, if we know that the child will likely survive but will be in a vegetative state for life, that would be a decision that someone could opt for an abortion. Those are our six exceptions, and I think they're all
mhm,
very reasonable and humane. The last one there, that one dealt with, for example, sometimes a baby is born who can't swallow.
mm,
And that's a very, the baby may survive, but the baby is going to have a lifetime of very, very, very severe problems. So to force someone, that might be a situation in which the woman should be able to, but if this baby is a healthy baby, and so forth. Then I believe we should be helping women through the crisis part of the crisis pregnancy
mhm,
rather than, I believe abortion to be an extreme overreaction to a set of difficult and unexpected circumstances.
mm, mm.
And I'd rather, when we have difficult and unexpected circumstances, death is not really something that we consider in any other situation.
Yeah.
And sometimes when those things happen, we have regrets and other issues that, when we overreact, sometimes things happen that we would like to take back. But anyway, there's so much but I believe it's okay to have exceptions to the rule, but we can still protect life and that's that's kind of what my bill was about. But of course, I would love to have the Utah Supreme Court issue their ruling on SB 174, which is currently enjoined, our
Mhm.
trigger bill. It's called that because, it was going to be triggered only if Roe fell, then this
Right.
bill would take its place. And since Roe has fallen, immediately in our state, it was enjoined and
Mhm.
it's waiting on the Utah Supreme Court. But once that is decided, now other states immediately went into they didn't have it enjoined. I don't know how they avoided that, but they
Well,
went
every state has
immediately.
different processes, and yeah.
Yeah, and different, the judge really had a lot of power in this situation, and he
Mhm.
wanted to hear, and he ruled in behalf of Planned Parenthood. So now it's at the Supreme Court, and it should be, I mean, we don't have a timeline, but it has been
Yeah.
heard by the court, but they haven't issued a decision.
Mm.
But that was
You
not
know,
but I would love to have my bill replaced.
yeah, there you go. Well, there's definitely a case you made for incrementalism, no matter what issues you support. Um, another aspect of the abortion issue I'd like to discuss with you is there's kind of this distorted idea out there that pro-choice is the woman's position, the
Mm,
that it's a woman's cause, and then pro-life is like, the handmaiden's tale, and a bunch of old
mm,
cranky white men trying to tell women what to do.
yeah.
But that hasn't been my experience at all when it comes to engaging with a lot of people that are super engaged in the pro-life movement. In fact, there's so many women leaders that are
Oh,
involved in the pro-life movement. Many of them are women who had abortions themselves,
exactly.
and the heart-wrenching post abortion consequences they had in dealing with it is what led them to become very solid pro-life advocates. Has that been your experience? Do you feel like it's just a lot of women involved in the pro-life effort?
Absolutely. In fact, I think many men feel like they're just totally silenced and sidelined because, they're not allowed to speak on the subject. But there are
Mm,
so many women, and like you said, many who have had abortions who are solidly pro-life, and very good advocates for the cause. Um, you know, there's no doubt about that. And that's because abortion does hurt women. And many times it really, in my experience too, many times these women were not, yes, they had the decision. They are the ones who decided to abort. They were given
mhm,
bad information in many cases. They were pressured in many cases by um, their boyfriends, their husbands, their parents, in some cases. Um, there are all kinds of circumstances, and um, it would not necessarily have been their decision. I know that, they were told it was a lump of cells instead
mhm,
of more detailed information about what the fetus looked like at that stage in the pregnancy and how things would go. And rather than having others around you say, we're going to help you through this, we're going to be there for you, we're going to support you. Um, they thought that their only choice was abort.
mhm,
And the replication, anyway, the outcome of that often is it harms women. I mean, there are some serious risks. Physical risks are rare, in terms of, death or, from an abortion. That's extremely rare, almost not worth mentioning, although it does happen, especially later in term. So the earlier, I mean, from the second trimester on, it's much more difficult and it only increases in risk approaching term. But also, besides physical health, and it can cause physical problems, the mental and emotional toll that abortion takes on women is huge. And the problem in the United States is, politically, we're not able to do studies. So to find good studies, you really have to look to socialized countries overseas to figure out what are the long-term implications for women, in terms of mental health. So for
mhm,
example, in Finland, they found an 81, no, the British Journal of Psychiatry found an 81% increase in mental trauma, for women after an abortion. That's 81%. I can't think of any other procedure that we would do that we would say, oh, yeah, it's perfectly fine and encourage people to have it done, knowing that. Also, it increases the risk of suicide dramatically, especially in that first year after the abortion. That's where the Finland comes in. They had a study of that and found that it was a threefold increase in risk. Um, that's the significant known statistical correlation between abortion and suicide, and that should be taken seriously. Also, future fertility. Many women who have an abortion don't realize that they may be jeopardizing their future fertility in terms of um, preterm birth and placenta previa, much more common in women who have had an abortion. And that costs taxpayers $1.2 billion dollars a year in complicated healthcare costs after for women who've had previous abortions. And then I know there are just, a lot of people deny that there's any that women are harmed at all by abortion. That it's simply it's a great thing for women.
Mm,
And it's not a great thing for women, and certainly not a great thing for female fetuses, but I mean, even beyond that, it's not great for women. So I agree with a lot of people throughout time. In fact, the suffragettes were pro-life.
mhm,
They were never pro-abortion. I mean, there may have been one or two that I'm not aware of, but that was part of the suffrage movement was actually pro-life. So it's really strange, but actually, as I've studied this, the beginnings of Roe, in New York, where they had an abortion clinic. Now, I know Roe was Texas, but the whole concept kind of began in the New York area, and it was based on false information about the popularity of the procedure and how harmless it was.
mhm,
And the man who was involved with that, and it was men largely, um, he has admitted that, yeah, we falsified the data.
mhm,
But that's, it's all, 50 years later or more actually.
mhm,
And now it's a little too late to call that all back. And now also the millions and millions and millions of abortions that have happened, not only, especially worldwide, but even in the United States. I mean, we are one of the most aborting countries
mhm.
with the most liberal abortion laws.
Yeah, you
So,
mentioned Europe earlier, and my understanding is that almost every country in Europe outright bans abortion in the third trimester.
oh,
Um,
I'm
and
sure they do.
and
I'm
and
sure.
yet in America, under the current post-Roe situation, states, if they want to, as you said before, can abort all the way up to conception. And so, and it's because, but once again, it's because we haven't wrestled with the issue, and now we're having to,
Mhm.
we're confronted with that question: when does life begin? When should it be protected? Um, and now scientifically, we have so much more information than they had 50 years ago when they decided Roe. I mean, you know, um, brain activity, response to outside stimuli, a
Mhm.
heartbeat, the ability to survive out of the womb earlier and earlier because of the technology we have. I mean,
Right.
um, my third child, my son, was born about a month earlier because we had some placenta problems, and he's just fine, Whereas 100 years ago, who knows what could have turned out from that kind of a consequence? And so we, as a people, as Americans, and we have to wrestle with these questions. We have to craft state level policy based upon how we feel about these questions, but we have to be able to talk about the topic, and I feel like we're slowly moving into that discussion area. So the last thing, I guess, let's talk about that toward the future. What do you see as the future of the pro-life movement? What kind of adjustments do you feel like the pro-life movement needs to make in the post-Roe era? And what do you foresee there being if there's ever a consensus on the issue in the next 30, 40 years?
Oh, wow. Great questions. But I would say, well, for me, we've mentioned the personhood of the fetus, and I still call the fetus a fetus. Some pro-life people don't like calling the fetus a fetus because it is a human being. But a fetus, I guess, in Latin is little one, and I just think that's cute. So
There you
I
go.
still use it. But personhood of the fetus has been convincingly established. And if you look back at the text of the Roe v. Wade decision, it actually says that if personhood is ever established for the unborn, the case for abortion rights collapses because the fetus right to live would then be guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment.
Mm,
And I think we've reached that point. The fetus has DNA, which we didn't know about when Roe came. The fetus is a unique human being, has a heartbeat, has facial features, um, fingerprints, everything that we consider a human being. and of course feels pain. So I think I would like people to know that the abortion procedure, especially after the first trimester, is the most violent and disgusting and graphic thing you can possibly imagine. I mean, I don't like to talk about it, and people, I mean, on who are pro-abortion don't want me to talk about it, but it's something that if you did it to a deceased um, corpse, that would be desecrating a corpse. It would be, but we're doing this in some cases to living human beings in the womb. And to me, that is, that's something that society should never tolerate. But like you said, we have to get there. We have to discuss it as people and rationally and reasonably, and we will, I think, arrive at the right place eventually. I mean, with some exceptions, there will be people who adamantly, are pro-abortion. But I think most people realize that, gosh, we don't want to, we want to help women. That's where I would like to see the abortion movement move, especially, for pro-life, helping the women more
Hmm.
through the crisis pregnancy and beyond, simplifying the adoption process and making that more cost effective. People just, it's very expensive to adopt, but it saves a human life in many cases. And it's a wonderful experience. But one of the things too that I've never really articulated, um, but I don't like when it comes to how women are being used in this debate. I think abortion, they through abortion, women have been made, have chosen, I guess, one baby at a time, usually, to are complicit in the numbers of babies who have been aborted. And, women in general are not, they're very peaceful, they're very nurturing, so I feel like, women are generally nonviolent. I think if women understand more of what is actually involved in an abortion procedure, especially beyond the first trimester, I think it might change the debate a little bit, but it's so grisly to talk about that we just don't. And when I have shared what is involved, and it is in gynecological journals and so forth, I mean, it's out there, it's not hidden, but
Hmm.
we just deny it. We live in denial about that. And but you're right, internationally and um, the United States falls in company with Russia, China, and North Korea when it comes to abortion numbers. That's not good company to be in.
No, not at all.
And we need children um, because to support the older generations, that's how it's always been. That's how nature designed it. Um, and in Utah, we have a culture of life,
Hmm.
and life is the starting point of absolutely everything else. So, if we don't encourage life and support life in meaningful ways, and there will be, I mean, it's not good for our society in so many ways, and including individual women. It harms them, and I think if women understand that better, if we can bring that to the fore instead of, clashing over um, small parts of the issue or something, or the larger, just the whole concept. I think if we can help people understand the true implications of abortion, there would be, I think most people would be pro-life. That's kind of what that Gallup poll that I cited, where only 13% of the people of our country support abortion in the third trimester
Hmm.
because they realize, well, wait a minute, that baby could survive outside of the womb, like your third child. Um,
Hmm.
and that does not seem like the right thing to do. So I think when we encourage people, to abort, we're basically giving them a vote of no confidence. Like, you can't possibly handle this.
Mm,
And we're denying them one of the best relationships that we can have as human beings is a mother and a child. We're denying them that experience, and we're denying their ability to nurture rather than just eradicate a problem, which is ultimately kind of a temporary problem if they were to choose to adopt instead of abort. But
mm,
um, you know, it's it's very, I don't know, I was just amazed by it. But as far as where we're going, well, here in Utah, we will have a decision at some point from the Utah Supreme Court. And while we await that, I guess there's not much we can do. We are kind of watching now to see what's taking so long. How many other
mm,
cases have they decided in the interim? Because it has been a while. Are they sitting
mhm,
on their hands? Are they, I don't know what they're waiting for. But meanwhile, since my bill came after Dobbs, I mean, it was finally enacted after Dobbs, um, that is saving a couple of thousand. I, I can't remember how many babies a year, but my bill allows abortions after 18 weeks because we had no choice. But
mm,
we couldn't get doctors who could testify to fetal pain perception before 18 weeks. And that was
mm.
a key aspect of the bill. So we decided to go with 18 weeks. We wanted to do 15, but this was at that time when the Supreme Court was enforcing that viability standard.
Ah, I
So,
see.
and I did take some flack for that. People thought, oh, you're not pro-life. You allow abortion after 18 weeks. No, I don't like that, but we had to draw the line because otherwise it would have failed on its face. It would never have made it to the Supreme Court, and we were aiming for that.
Now, I'll probably end up quoting this in almost every interview I do because I love the quote so much. But Benjamin Franklin said that politics is the art of the possible, and sometimes it's unfortunate when those who are in the arena trying to get things done, trying to see what's possible, um, and they end up taking flack from their own sides because they don't choose a hill to die on and lose on.
Right. I
So,
mean, we want to win, we want to make progress. And I'm so glad that we do have the trigger law. It's
mm,
ready as soon as the Supreme Court decides, and we will maintain our exceptions. Now, one of those exceptions, the left or the pro-abortionists are always one of those is the rape exception. And currently in Utah, to go with that exception, you have to have filed a police report.
mm,
And I believe that is correct, the right way to do it. If there's a rapist out there, we need to know about it.
mhm.
Um, but many people want to eliminate that police report requirement. But I think that is an essential part of our exceptions. So we
How
still
do
have,
they propose documenting a case of rape without the police report? I'm just curious if they have
they would
an
just
alternative.
know what they would like is just to be able to say, I was raped, give me an abortion.
Mm,
So, but if you were indeed raped, then we need to have a police report so that that person can be, um, prosecuted for rape and this doesn't happen again.
mm.
So
Well,
they,
and 9 months is well within the statute of limitations, so they could file a police report foreseeably at any point along the pregnancy, you would assume.
right. Yeah, but they would have to file a police report. And that is a
Mhm.
serious thing. It's
Oh, yeah.
it's not as it's not as easy as just declaring that you were raped. So, and
Right.
I know there are actually you know, there are issues around that, but I just wanted to mention that that is another thing where they're trying to chip away at what we do have,
Hmm, hmm.
even while we're waiting for the trigger law to take, to be decided. So,
Okay. Well,
It's
hey, Representative Acton, thank you so much for meeting with me. I know this is an issue that's hard to talk about for a lot of people,
it
and I
is.
appreciate you willing your candor and your honesty and willing to come and talk about this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks for inviting me, and it was good to start thinking